We've been holding a number of webinars throughout the year. This is our final webinar, and we're very grateful to two outstanding panelists who've taken time out of their busy schedule to join us. And they're both going to be speaking about a fascinating topic, and that is women in leadership. And they know a lot about it because they actually teach the course called Women and Leadership. Let me introduce both of them to you. I'm going to be asking them questions, but you're going to be hearing mainly from them and not me today. The first is Allison Spada. Allison is Associate Vice President and Chief of Staff in the Office of the Dean at Georgetown University Law Center. And the other panelist is someone who's very active in our section. In fact, she's on the executive committee and gives me advice so I can be a better chair. And that's Professor Hilary Sale. Hilary is the Agnes Williams Professor of Leadership and Corporate Governance at the Georgetown University Law Center, but she also wears another hat too. She's Professor of Management at Georgetown University McDonough School of Business, so she's got two hats. I'm going to ask both Allison and Hilary to tell a little bit about themselves because I don't think I can do it justice. They're so impressive. So Allison, would you start by giving a little bit of background, and then we'll ask Hilary, and then I'll delve into my questions.
Sure. Thanks so much. And thanks so much to you, Dean Fisher, for having us both here today. I'm so delighted to be here to talk with all of you. We just, before we went live on the Zoom, decided who was going to go first. And I drew the long straw, I think, because I did not want to go after Professor Sale, whose bio and accomplishments are quite extraordinary. But a little bit about myself. I started out many years ago as an actual lawyer, practicing lawyer. I graduated from Cornell Law School, which I'm contractually obligated not to talk about anymore now that I work at Georgetown and have worked here for so long. But I started out in New York, which was my home state, as a litigator in New York City, and then transferred to my firm's DC office. I litigated here in Washington, DC for a little bit. And then I came over to Georgetown in 2005. First in the Office of Admissions as one of the admissions officers reviewing all the applications that came through. And since 2005, I've pivoted to a lot of different roles here at the law school, which has been kind of an interesting and exciting journey for me here, and which has kept me really engaged and learning throughout my higher ed career. Our dean, Bill Traynor, has really given me some kind of amazing opportunities to learn and grow, and so created the role of chief of staff for me, which I moved into in 2017, I guess now 2016, 2017, and so have really along with him and the leadership team, been able to shape the vision and the future for the school, which I'm really grateful for. Starting July 1st, when our chief operating officer left, I have been sitting in the role of acting chief operating officer here at the law school. And that has been its own sort of learning journey since July 1, a different kind of leadership with a different kind of portfolio. I'm still sitting in my chief of staff seat. So I'm doing several jobs right now, which is also a lesson in calendar management among other things. But I'm really delighted to be with you here today. I'm here because Professor Sale, who I got to know very well on the leadership team, talked to me about a class that she has long been teaching on women in leadership, and generously invited me to co-teach with her. So I started doing that a few years ago, really as a novice teacher, and but eager teacher and student, and have learned so much from being able to co-teach with her and just observe her in the classroom. She's quite remarkable. So thank you for having me here today, and I'll turn it over to you, Professor Sale.
Okay, Hilary, please go ahead.
Thank you. So I am a professor at Georgetown. As Dean Fisher said, I teach both in the law school and the business school. Actually, I teach women in leadership in the business school, among other exec ed offerings over there. I started doing this work, actually, the leadership work, through a program called Direct Women, which is run out of New York City. It's an organization focused on helping women lawyers get public company board seats. And I started working with a lot of talented women there, and then began sort of channeling some of what I was learning there and thinking about into leadership classes. And over the years, I've taught a lot of different leadership classes, although I continue to teach my basic staple of the basic corporations class and other corporate governance related materials. I also sit on boards. I sat on the FINRA board for a while, which was both educational in terms of watching a lot of powerful leaders operate in the boardroom, and also powerful in terms of corporate governance. And I now sit on the regulatory boards of SIBO, and knock on wood, I'm joining a publicly traded company board that should be announced later this week, which I'm really excited about.
Oh,
But all of those have been great opportunities to think about leadership in action and learn about women leaders, in particular for this class. Although, as we discussed in our prep session, I teach classes that don't involve just women or just women leaders. So we can go from there.
okay. Before I ask a few questions, I just want all of you to know that after I've asked questions for about maybe 15, 20 minutes, I'm going to open up to all of you. And all I ask is that when you ask your question, that you turn your camera on and you unmute yourself so we can see you. But we don't require the camera on otherwise, because we realize some of you might be multitasking at the moment, which it happens in life, and that's fine. I want to begin by asking both of you to describe this course that you teach. And while you do that, answer the question why you teach this course and why it's important. And Hillary, I'm going to begin with you.
Okay, thank you. So I will say I teach this class because I care about these issues, and I think it's helpful to focus specifically on some of the challenges that women face. As I said before, I teach leadership to men, and actually this class is open to men. We've never had any enroll at the law school, but you never know what next year will bring. But I'm interested in talking every day in the classroom about the research on gender and work and how we can think about that research and focus on what we can do for ourselves. And by that, I mean, and I'm sure Allison will expand on this, but this is not a class about institutional change. It is not a class about labor and employment law. In fact, there's no law content whatsoever in the class. It is not a class where we think about how to make change in organizations. It is a class about the strategies we can deploy to advocate better for ourselves, to strategize better about our careers, and to manage some of the barriers that we face in the workplace in the best way using our strong suits. And those are all skills, honestly, I wish I were better at. I spent 3 years as an associate dean for strategy at Georgetown. I think I'm an effective advocate, but I think there are lots of ways in which I could have deployed those skills even better. And I certainly learned a lot about myself and how to think about leadership in that context while doing that role. Allison?
Yeah, so I came to this class via Professor Sale, right? I got to know her particularly well when she was an associate dean, which was mostly through the pandemic. Every day was an organizational and leadership challenge for all of us who were on the leadership team during that time. It was really a time of throwing out the rule book and rewriting it every single day for 2.5 to 3 years. So it was, it was leadership by fire, trial by fire, I think, every day. And I found myself talking to Hillary a lot about the theories behind leadership and what we were doing and how to be effective advocates, how I could be the most effective advocate. And so we really did spend a lot of time talking about that. And I got more and more intrigued with, I had been a leader for a long time, but without any formalized training and without really thinking much about the theories and strategies behind what I was doing. So I became really curious about that, and frankly spent a lot of time talking to Hillary about that, who was much more grounded in the research than I was. And when she invited me to co-teach this class with her, it was really exciting for me to be able to dive in and understand the theories behind leadership and the strategies behind how to deploy it. Uh, I had been a manager for a long time and had run departments and groups, but I think co-teaching, learning from her, and also learning, frankly, from the students in the classroom through that sort of collective dialogue has changed the way I lead and the way I think about leadership in pretty dramatic ways. So it's a privilege to be involved with that class.
Hillary, you mentioned that there is no law content. Is this class, however, different if it were a class of non-lawyers? In other words, do you gear it to the fact that these are women law students, even though there's no law content?
No, really. So the class I teach at the business school, for example, also called Women in Leadership,
Right.
has very similar content. At the business school, we have a lot of classes that are taught in what we call mini modules. And I teach this by my own choice in a mini module instead of a semester-long version. So that means I end up having to pick and choose some of the content. The students are very, very different, which makes the classroom discussion different. And by that, I mean, this is a team-based class. We do a lot of teamwork. We do a lot of breakouts. We do a lot of exercises. We practice everything that we're teaching the theory or the research on. We practice it in the classroom. And the business school students are not shy about it the way the law students are. I think that higher introvert population at the law school has an impact on at least the beginning of the semester. And the business school students are actually graded. They receive letter grades, whereas at the law school, although we at Georgetown do have letter grades, we made a conscious choice to make this a required pass-fail class, in part because of some of the conversations that we end up having in the classroom. But the business school students just dive into the teamwork. They're used to it. It's a big part of what MBAs do all the time. And they thrive in the idea that they're building a whole new network in the classroom instantly. And the law students are much slower to come to that.
I assume that one of your premises is that women leaders generally do have barriers that men do not, and therefore must have strategies that men do not necessarily use. Is that a fair premise?
It is. It's a premise, by the way, and Allison can talk about this too. It's a premise that our law students can't stand. It makes them very angry.
And explain that a little bit more.
You want to start, Allison?
Yeah, I think what we struggle with in the class, right? And as Hillary mentioned, it's been all female classes so far. So it would be curious to see how a man in the room would change the dynamic. But, they're frustrated by the institutions. They really want to focus on institutional change. And a lot of us do, but it's not the purpose of the class. The purpose of the class is skill building and deploying personal strategies in their careers, right? It's not that institutional change isn't important. It's just that's not what the class is intended to do. So lawyers and law students understandably chafe against that because they really want to talk about the systems, right? And how to break down the systems and change the systems. And so we from time to time in class have to remind them that's not what we're here to do. I will say, with respect to the barriers, right, it's backed up by the data. When you look at the number of female as compared to male students in law school today, right? It's over 50% women enrolled in law schools, over 50% graduating in 23 and 22. And then you look at associates, right? More than 50% of associates at big US law firms are now women. And then you look at partnership. There must be a barrier because it is not reflected in the same numbers that you see in terms of partnership or leadership among lawyers in the same numbers. So there's something there.
And even
I
though
think there is a lot there. Oh, sorry.
No, You're the panelist. I never interrupt. Go.
I was just going to say the research is pretty compelling, and it's, it's from the small and annoying and frustrating to the large. And by that, I mean, if we advocate strongly, we get pushback. If we talk about our accomplishments, we're seen as bragging. If we get interrupted far more than our male counterparts in meetings, and our ideas get stolen. I mean, there's 1,000 more pieces of research. All of those are proved 100 times over, and that's not a diversity problem, right? It's an inclusion problem. And what we focus on, and I do this work in firms and companies as well, there I might talk more about what they as leaders should do to change that environment. But when we're talking to our students about it, I'm much more focused on how they can think about how to show up in a meeting and how to manage being interrupted and still carry through their ideas and still speak with confidence so that their ideas can be heard. I think my business school students, just in contrast, they're like, oh yeah, we know that. And we'll take this, any strategy you have to fix this. Whereas the law students, and this is increasingly true because I've been teaching this course for a while, probably I've moved from one generation down to Gen Z now. Gen Z is much more complex on this issue and much more unwilling to recognize that these things are going to happen in the workplace, and the workplace won't just change in a way that feels better to them. And honestly, I admire their desire for that.
Let's talk about how you teach, the materials and techniques you use, because in some ways, at least for law schools, you have a unique technique that you use. Not so unique to business schools, but pretty unique to law schools. Am I right about that?
Yes, yes.
And would you tell us what that is?
Yeah. I guess I'll start.
Yeah, okay.
We use all business school materials.
Make it easier.
except
Sometimes
one
I'll mention
case.
your name first because I see it. You each are deferring to each other. So I'll start mentioning names. Okay, go ahead, Hillary.
Okay.
Okay.
So we use all business school materials as opposed to, there's one law case that I helped co-write for Harvard Law School's executive education program. But the rest of the case studies that we use come from Harvard Business School. We work pretty hard at getting a diverse set of cases, and I'm going to say in the largest sense of diversity. We talk about things like race and gender and ethnicity every day in the classroom, literally every day, because you can't talk about these issues without also talking about those, as well as issues of, sexuality and other things that come up. The students often bring them up, but if they don't, we do. I'm just going to say one other thing because somebody put it in the chat, but it fits into what we're saying. Intersectionality in this space is pretty complex because of the way research is done. We have a lot of research about men and women, partly because it's easy to get 50-50 populations to test. When it comes to race and ethnicity, we have some research, but less because it's hard to get a population that's got a lot of women and a lot of women who are Black, because, for example, if you're African American, some of the stereotypes and tensions are different than if you are Latina, for example. So it's really complex, but what we have in the way of research, we share. And we pick cases, and I'm just going to give Harvard Business School a shout out here. When I first started doing this work, there were like 1 or 2 cases in their database that were about women leaders who succeeded. There were lots of cases about women leaders who failed. And forget diverse women. They have worked very hard actually to build a much better database of cases. And I'm going to say one more thing and then hand it off to Allison. The beauty of Harvard Business School, for those of you who've never dived into their case database, is that you can get an account as a professor, and many of them have teaching notes, and many of the teaching notes have research in them, so that you're not out there floundering around. And it's kind of fun to pick through the cases, read the teaching notes, which they will allow you to download, and see if the material resonates or can be useful to you. So let me stop talking and pass it off to Allison.
Allison,
your thoughts on using the case studies?
I love the case studies, and I haven't done this as long as Hillary has done it, but they always the conversation around them is different every time, depending on the cohort in the room, which is also endlessly interesting to me, right? People picking up on really different things in the case depending on who you've got in the room, which is great. We also complement that with a lot of practical things that we're doing in the classroom, practicing the strategies that we're talking about in the cases and in the curriculum. And we also bring in a lot of guest speakers. And so one of the things that we're doing in anticipation of the class is trying to bring in a wide range of perspectives, which includes diversity and intersectionality. If we can find, we lean heavily on alumni when we're trying to pull in guest speakers, so they can say, "Hey, I sat where you're sitting," and there's a real connection with the students in the classroom. And what we try to do is prep them in advance with the reading materials for that particular class, so they know what we're going to be covering in the class. They know what the topic is for that day, whether it be strategy or networking or pitching or whatever it's going to be for that particular day. And we ask them to just try to think about that when they're thinking about what they want to talk about. They don't necessarily have to be experts in the research, but if they can tie what they're talking about in class to the theme of the day, it helps us drive the points home for the case, which can be really effective. Then obviously we let students ask whatever questions they want to ask about their career trajectories or leadership paths, but it's nice to be able to tie it to what the case is talking about. And what I've found, right, Hillary, is that the guest speakers are kind of excited to be back in the learning and teaching mode, so they do engage with the material, which is fun. Because more often than not, they're trying to incorporate that into what they're talking with the students about, which is great.
Yeah.
Is the class size kept?
Can I add one more thing about the case studies? Because this comes up, I often get this question. They're not lawyers in the case studies, they're business
Right.
people. I happen to like that. I think it's good for people to think about leadership in other contexts and compare it to their own experience. But if you wanted case studies with lawyers, there's like 2 in the Harvard database as opposed to in the business school database, as opposed to in the law school one.
Now, doesn't Harvard Law School have some case studies as well?
They do, and you could correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think they have great teaching notes, not because they don't want them, but just because they haven't gotten there yet, which makes them harder to teach if you haven't seen them taught before.
Is the class size capped?
It is capped. It's capped at 30. And actually it used to be smaller than that. And then when we decided to co-teach, I said, well, we could up the enrollment if there's 2 of us. There's a lot of reflection papers. Again, they're not graded, and we do peer-based feedback, but also they want to talk a lot and not just in the classroom. They're in office hours a lot. They have a lot on their minds and they want to share it. And so having a larger class makes that hard. I think also, this doesn't come up in my business school class as much, but a lot of the students in the class have experienced harassment or assault in the workplace, sexual harassment or assault. And they do want to talk about it, and which I can tell you, I find one of the more challenging aspects of the class. But I think in part because it's all women, it often comes up, and having a smaller class makes it a lot easier to have those conversations.
Can you give us an example of a case study you use that's particularly effective, and describe briefly the fact pattern and what skills come out of that fact pattern?
Sure. Allison, you want to pick one and I'll pick one?
Sure. Do you want to talk about we could talk about the crew The crew team.
You talk about the crew one and I'll talk about
Okay.
Harris.
Yeah. So one of the cases we use is a case study really on teamwork. It's meant to drive home sort of the roles of different people on a team, roles, responsibilities, and how high performing teams can either function at a high performing level or can fall apart depending on leadership and whether or not the people really understand their roles in a team. The case study involves the crew team at West Point, the coach. Hillary knows a lot about crew because she has this in her personal life. I learned a lot about crew from her and from having read this case and then researched. And interestingly, we teach it in the class, but Hillary and I also taught an executive education program together where I taught this case to non-US citizens, and they really did not know at all what crew was. So I had to start with the very basics of crew, which was itself interesting. But the case really deals with the varsity and the junior varsity teams. The varsity team was sort of the strongest performers. JV team was kind of the next strongest performers, but for some reason, after the teams were chosen, the varsity team kept outperforming did I say varsity?
You
I
said
need
it back.
another cup of coffee. Yeah, the JV team kept outperforming the varsity team. And so the coach was trying to figure out what was going on here. And so we really use the case to illustrate that you can put together a team of your strongest players that don't necessarily end up being your strongest team. And it goes to a lot of your team dynamics, how you work together as a team, whether or not you clearly understand your role and responsibility vis-a-vis all of the other team members, and also what the role of the coach or the leader is in either disrupting a bad cycle, how they can disrupt a bad cycle, encourage a strong cycle, and what do you do when you're the leader of a team that is in some ways failing, right? Or in your eyes failing, how do you get in there and coach? So it brings up a lot of different questions for them to talk about leadership styles. One thing that we have found, and I'm not sure, right, because I don't teach in the same way you do, Hillary, but a lot of the students in this class tend to have been athletes, varsity athletes. I don't know if the subject matter is drawing athletes in a different way than it does, but we found that a lot of the students in the class have been competitive athletes. And so this case in particular, they've got experience on different kinds of teams and have lots of thoughts about, appropriate ways to coach and appropriate ways to be team members. And so trying to get them to think about that in relation to their law practice and their legal practice is kind of an interesting thing. I mean, the other thing that I think is very different about this cohort than potentially business school students is they don't often work in teams during law school, right? They have been on teams or might even currently be at teams if they're part-time evening students who also currently have a job. They're functioning in teams and student organizations, but they don't do team-based projects in the same way that business school students or other graduate school students might. And so sometimes they forget about the team concept while they're in law school because it can be kind of a solitary experience. And so reminding them that their practice is going to be team-based. No matter what they're doing, they're going to have to be able to function as a member of some kind of a team. So you get some really interesting things out of that case.
Okay, Hillary?
So I just want to say I love that case. It's not the first case I ever taught, but it's one of the earliest. And one of the great things about it is that it's an all-male team with a male coach. And so teaching it in a classroom full of women, it usually produces a pretty interesting conversation.
Mm-hmm.
I think probably my favorite case right now is a case about Carla Harris, who was and probably still isn't, but was the highest ranking African-American woman on Wall Street. And I will say the first few times I taught it, just as a white woman in the majority population, I felt a little uncomfortable talking about race. And I'm not going to say I feel super comfortable now. I think I've just gotten better at it. We spend a lot of time talking about generosity of spirit in the classroom so that people can talk about these issues. Otherwise, we'll never discuss them. The thing about Carla Harris, there's a lot of things packed into that case, but some of the most amazing things packed into the case are the fact that, for example, when she gets to Wall Street after having grown up poor in the South and being told that if she should go to college at all, it should probably be a community college. And she defies all of that, gets herself into Harvard College and then Harvard Business School. And then she gets to Wall Street and she's doing her job and she gets feedback that she's not tough. It's laughable to me, that feedback. It's also very gendered, right? But her response to it is super powerful. Her response to it is, I'm not going to get defensive. I'm going to assume good intentions. If I assume good intentions, that means I'm not showing how tough I am. I'm actually just not bringing that part of myself to work. And then she says, I'm going to try out for 90 days. I'm going to walk differently in the hallways. I'm going to answer questions differently. I'm going to speak differently. And she tries all this stuff, literally shifting the dynamic in a really powerful way. And to me, right, there's some huge takeaways there about how we can respond to feedback, the choices we can make around it, even when some of it's completely unfounded. I think that's huge, right? I think there's lots of other takeaways in that case. There's some research on uniqueness, and being an African-American woman on Wall Street when she was super unique. In the leadership zone, that's what we call a blessing and a burden. Uniqueness gets you noticed, and uniqueness gets you noticed, right? Both ways. And that can be both very powerful and empowering, and also very challenging and problematic. So she's just awesome. If nobody's seen her TED Talks, you should. She's got two, if not 3 leadership books out now. And I'm just a huge fan.
I follow
Sounds
her
like
on
Jasmine.
LinkedIn now. She sometimes gives you little nuggets of wisdom along the way.
I'm going to open it up now.
Pearls. Carla's pearls of wisdom, right?
That's what she calls them,
Right.
Carla's pearls.
Pearls of wisdom. Well, that's true with both of you too. Okay, I'm going to open it up to the audience, and any of you can ask a question. All I ask is that you put your camera on and you unmute yourself. And if there's more than about 30 seconds of awkward silence, I will ask another question. We have 10 seconds of awkward quiet. Oh, Joan, is that you?
That's me. I'm happy to ask a question.
Joan Hemingway. She always saved me. Thank you, Joan.
Well, I'm not saving you. I'm super stimulated by this and really delighted. Obviously, Hillary, to see you in 2D. I'd love to see you in 3D sometime soon. And Allison, would love to meet you. Any friend of Hillary's is a friend of mine. So my question actually has to, I'm really intrigued by this, the Crew case, and I would like very much to read it. But it made me think of another aspect of leadership that I'm wondering whether business school cases and whether your curriculum covers, that I have issues with sometimes, that are gender-based or based on group identity, which is the leading from where you stand as opposed to leading with a title. So I'm wondering if you could tell me how, if at all, your course addresses that, since so many people don't see themselves as leaders. And I think that may be more particularly true of women, minorities, people who've been in circumstances where they felt like they're not in positions of power by title or otherwise.
Okay, who wants to go first?
I can start. The Army Crew case actually in some ways is quite good for that, because one of the questions that comes up in that case is, who is the leader? Like, is it the coach? Is it the stroke? Is it the team captain? Or is it the cox, right? If you don't know anything about rowing teams, you might not know what all of those different positions are. And who's calling the shots, right? Because the coach is deciding who's in what boat. But crew teams, unlike other teams, and I don't know much about sports generally, but crew teams, unlike a football team, once the crew team's out there on the water, they're on their own. Whereas in a football team, you could call a timeout, you could substitute in a player, right? There's a very different dynamic. So I think it allows for that. I don't think I usually address quite as much it quite as much the way you framed it, Joan, as I do talking about power versus influence. And because I think in a law firm, a lot of power structures are pretty flat. And so you have, and you know, when you're a third year associate, you have the opportunity to lead on teams, but you're going to have to lead more from influence than almost anything else. And so I sometimes talk about that difference, but not framing it quite the way you do.
Okay, Allison, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And I would add that some of the concepts that we work on in the class in terms of personal advocacy and managing your own career path are really they're tools to get to leadership quicker, right? One of the things we talk to the students about is knowing what it looks like to be successful and advocating for the opportunities to learn those skills and work on those skills, even if it's scary, even if it's not partners or others, more senior attorneys bringing those projects to you. You have to figure out what is it that I need to know at the end of my first year of practice to be proficient in what I want to do. Hey, I'm not getting those things or opportunities. How do I go and advocate so that I can put myself on a leadership track or I can become a leader in my career? So some of it is through the skill building that we're trying to do with these students to get them into positions to not only think of themselves as leaders and future leaders, but to actually position themselves to be leaders and future leaders as they plan their careers out.
Have you found that there is one or two particular skills that students say to you, I really want to develop these skills, tell me how to do it? In other words, they prioritize a set of skills and say, these are the ones I really want to learn. Do any emerge for you?
I think we would prioritize the set of skills. I'm not sure they would prioritize them the same way.
Well, if they don't,
I
why
think
don't you then?
self-advocacy is very tough for
Okay.
people. I'm not sure if they would say, I don't know if our students would say to us, I want to prioritize self-advocacy, but I think it's the one that women in particular struggle the most with, and why we talk about mentorship and sponsorship and also supporting others in the workplace. It's a lot easier for me to say, and now you're going to hear from Hillary Sale, who is one of the most accomplished teachers you're ever going to talk to, which, by the way, also has the benefit of being true. You don't want to say it if it's not true, right? But the flip is true. So if you can have an advocate who's a mentor, a sponsor, someone, it goes a long way in helping with that. But I don't know, what would you say about prioritizing?
Well, I'm with Allison in terms of prioritizing self-advocacy. We actually have a pitching exercise. It's one I created. We make them pitch regularly in breakout groups with each other, trying out, asking for things, creating scenarios that might happen if there are 2L over the summer. The class is usually mostly 3Ls. And if they're 3Ls, it's all about, okay, well, what was your experience in whatever job you had last summer? How would you like to replay that differently? Let's role play it. Let's learn to ask for what you need and how to get it. And next week, we have two weeks of classes left. Next week, they drew a scenario out of a hat and they will all pitch in front of the class without having practiced it and get feedback. And we have a strong feedback norm in the classroom that feedback has to be firm, clear, and critical, as well as kind. We have eschewed niceness because niceness just gets in the way, but we really expect people to offer very strong critical feedback to each other. And so they will pitch, we'll split the class in half. So they will pitch in front of half the class, they will get feedback from all of those people, and then we'll move on to the next one. And that I know they find intimidating.
That sounds fascinating. Could you give an example maybe of a scenario that you pull out of the hat that they had to do?
Yeah, one of them is you've scheduled a meeting with the dean of the law school about something you want changed. prepare yourself to go in there and have a conversation with the dean about why he should make the change you want made at Georgetown Law. Another one is, I think you want to talk to the managing partner of the firm where you're going to practice about why the firm should make a particular change. You know, they're just different things like that that are a little bit out of the zone. They're not so much about asking for feedback, something we practice all the time, but more a little bit less like what we practice in class all the time.
Fascinating. Okay. Even though I'm keeping asking questions, I want you to know that if you have a question, you can interrupt me mid-sentence and I will stop and have you ask the question. So
Or you can put them in the chat if you don't want to turn your
that's right.
screen.
Thank you for saying that. You're right. You can use the chat. And
Throw them in the chat.
I see Joan making a comment, but that's not a question. So I don't see any other questions, but I'll look at the chat as we say this.
I could throw out one other thing that the students find very uncomfortable if you want. We do more than one session on strategic networking. And in my experience, women often see the idea of being really strategic around networking as sort of political. We do an exercise from HBS for them. Step one, they analyze their network by filling out a particular exercise. And then we take that data and we put it into an anonymous spreadsheet where they can see, you know, where they fall relative to their peers. We do some breakout conversations on it. And then we come back and we talk about what's missing in their networks and how they're going to go fix it and what the research tells us about why it's important to fix it. And then we take that and we attach it to another exercise. Over the course of the semester, we help them build 5-year personal strategic growth plans, which for most law students, 5 years out seems like a century. But one of our focuses is at some point you have to stop preserving your options and you have to start living them. And it's a lot easier to do if you build a plan and think about what that might feel like.
The strategic network feels very transactional to them. And there's
Very
something about that feels uncomfortable and sort of a little unseemly sometimes until you really start talking about the why, right?
Joan asked, do you talk about communication styles and values as a component of female leadership?
Allison, you want to go first?
Yes, this is also a very controversial topic because we also talk about authenticity, right? You want to go into your career being authentic and being yourself, but being authentic doesn't necessarily mean you can't modulate and, you know, in the words of Carla Harris, try on different versions of your personality or your presence to figure out what's going to work for you in the work environment. And this is where I think, and maybe it's a little bit generational too, this feels a little uncomfortable to people, right? So we talk about upspeak, right? Ending your comment with a question. We talk about how you present, how you show up. One of Hillary's mantras that I've adopted is you have to set your default to contribute in a meeting. So go into a meeting with the expectation that you are going to contribute, which also means you have to have done your homework and understand what the meeting is going to be about. So you have something of value to contribute. But if you're in a meeting, you should be speaking in the meeting, even if you're a first-year associate, maybe especially if you're a first-year associate. So we do talk about that. And this is communication styles is often something that is uncomfortable because people want to bring their authentic self to work and they oftentimes don't want to have to adapt it at all. But sometimes what they're bringing is not the most effective version of themselves in that moment. So we talk to them about trying different things on to see what works.
Sounds like how they reacted to strategic networking, that it was too political, right?
Yes, exactly. We do talk about the research on executive presence. And I have certainly had students, not at the business school, they do not fight the hypos at the business school, and they do not fight the research. They do other stuff, right? But at the law school, they fight the hypos and they fight the research. So a comment that will come up with respect to that research is, well, isn't that just a male paradigm? And I say, really, I think data wins whether you're male or female. And the executive presence research is pretty compelling about learning to be more direct, connecting your hand motions to your words, having data to back up what you say instead of describing how the team feels. It's what the team produces and how that impacts the organization. And we talk about that a lot. I mean, we talk about how most associates in law firms, but also students in nonprofits and elsewhere, are expected to self-evaluate. And we talk about how you could self-evaluate in an effective way, how you could take what you do and connect it to the economic growth proposition of your enterprise, whether it's for-profit or nonprofit. And that would be about showing your contributions rather than making a list of all the tasks you do.
Here's a question from Bree. One of you mentioned that Gen Z doesn't understand that certain situations, like getting interrupted, is inevitable in the workplace. Do you think it's possible that they do understand but don't want to carry the burden of managing those situations that could be avoided with better communication or more efficient workplace practices? And does your course help your students to learn how to cope with this tension?
We do talk about how they can manage it themselves in the moment and some of the strategies that are there in the research. And I always say being interrupted constantly is not okay. It's not an inclusive practice. And when you have the opportunity to set the norms, useful norms include everybody speaks once before anyone speaks twice, no interrupting rules. I have a sort of list of inclusive practices. But I happen to agree with you, by the way, they don't want to carry the burden. I also think that's not going to change the fact that it's happening in the workplace. And then the question is always how you choose when to advocate directly about it. I mean, when I was an associate dean, my male counterparts interrupted me in associate dean meetings. It was appalling. It was unacceptable. And sometimes I would push back and sometimes I would just gently and firmly keep talking. But often I would wish that somebody else would address it. And that we talk about all the time. It's what we call sideways advocacy, advocating for other people. So when that happens, saying, hold on, I want to hear the rest of what Allison had to say. The challenge is when you don't feel empowered, how to manage that.
I love that term, sideways communication. I'd not heard that before, but that's really good. Sideways advocacy. I love it. We have another question.
We did a lot of that, Hillary and I, sideways advocacy.
That's good. Dana asks, do you envision teaching the class differently in the near future, considering many women may be feeling particularly deflated, marginalized, and excluded?
I'm looking at you. I mean, I'm not sure if it changes the way we would teach, but I think you have to hold space for people to be able to share how they're feeling and how it impacts what we're talking about in the classroom for sure.
I agree with that. I'm not teaching this class next semester. I don't know how it would feel. I do think with 30 students and judging from what little of the data I've seen coming out of the election, for example, odds are good I have students who voted on both sides of that equation in that classroom. It has not come up much this semester, other than having occasional students bring up specific instances of misogyny or racism that they have experienced through the campaigns. That's come up a little bit. It's come up less than I anticipated, I have to say. And for various reasons, the class didn't meet this week, and that would have been the first time after the election. So it might well have come up then.
What will your final classes of the semester look like?
Next week is the pitches in front of the class. The last week of the semester is always team projects. And for the team projects, they're again assigned in a team a project that they have to make a presentation to the class. And they also have to produce a PowerPoint, a slide deck, or a tool. For example, one of them is to produce a TED Talk on how to effectively pitch. And they have to do it as a team and teach other people how to do it. Another one is to design a guest speaker series for the class based on our alumni, to do some research about alumni that they think could come in and share different viewpoints in the classroom. There's, I think, 5 different projects, and they're divided into teams of 6 to make presentations, which requires them to coordinate and do all of the team-based skills that we talk about.
Allison, anything you want to add to that?
I got distracted by someone's comment in the chat, and I'm trying to find it again.
Is that the one from Dana that says creating space?
Yes.
Uh,
Yes, and I totally agree with that, Dana.
But Allison, before you answer it, let me
Yeah.
read the question.
Oh.
Dana said, creating space for conversations is key, but you also don't want the class to be just a venting session. So how would you suggest tying that to class themes?
Yes, and that's true in every single class, right? Every one of these topics is going to bring up something for someone in the classroom that they can relate to, and they want to share stories. And once the first person shares a story, everyone wants to share a story. And you can very easily drift away from the skill building that you're trying to do or the case that you're trying to teach. So I think that's always a challenge. And Hillary and I are always kind of trying to steer the class back to the topic at hand. So it's a delicate balance, right? You want to encourage people to share, but you also want to get back to the skill building. We said in the beginning, this really wasn't a class about changing institutions. So this is not a class that is going to be able to somehow systematically address racism, misogyny, all of these kinds of big issues, right? It's not what it's designed to do. So it's really getting back to, okay, what's the topic of today? Is it networking? Is it pitching? Is it personal advocacy? And how can we tie back in the conversation to whatever the skill it is that we're trying to build, and maybe incorporate whatever the difficulty is with what we're addressing into what that skill building is designed to do, how you might encounter it in your professional lives, how you might deal with it, how you might use your network, how you might form alliances, all of these kinds of things. So, I mean, these topics are big, and so they can easily flow in any number of directions, but we are trying to bring it back to the skill building every single time, which again, sometimes students don't appreciate that because they want to talk about the big picture issues. They want to talk about sort of the institutional umbrella issues that are concerning them, and which are legitimate, right? But you know, we're there to do something that's pretty specific.
I have
And
go ahead, Hillary, I'm sorry.
That I was just going to add to that by saying we start every class with, does anybody want to talk about skills they've tried out since the last time? And we get great stuff out of that.
Yeah.
People talk about how they managed being interrupted in the classroom, or, you know, from the small to the large, you know, things they're trying out and thinking about. I'm going to also just put my email in the chat, but it's super straightforward. It's hillary.sale@georgetown.edu. There's a question in there about materials, and I'm happy to send you the syllabus.
Oh, that's great. Well, since we're near the end of our hour, I'm going to ask you 2 final questions. One is, Hillary, you said earlier on that you've learned things about yourself from this course. So my first question is, what have each of you learned about yourself from teaching the course? And second, if you could only give 1 or 2 takeaways from this last hour that you want all of us to remember about teaching women in leadership, what would it be? Who wants to go first? I think I'm going to put Allison on the spot for what you've learned, and I'll put Hillary on the spot for the takeaway, but both of you have to answer both questions.
Okay, I've learned I always have something to learn. I learned something new every class, either from the research or from Hillary or from our guest speaker or from the students. And so, there's no end to learning about leadership. And I've also learned that it's actually fun to try this stuff out, and it can be quite liberating when you try something and you think, oh, that worked. I didn't get interrupted. Or, hey, I ran that meeting differently and look at the results. So I think that's been a really optimistic thing about the tangible things that can come out of this class is that you can actually see results. It doesn't mean that everything's perfect and you don't continue to get frustrated. But one of the great things is that I like trying new things all the time. And so it is fun to implement the things that we learn and share in the class and just test it. Which is fun.
Hillary, what have you learned about yourself?
I have learned that, like many a good law student and law professor, I have some ingrained cynicism, a really good habit of picking everything apart before listening to it fully. And that learning to rein myself in, assume good intentions, and even if the intentions are not good, assuming them from the beginning allows me A, to be a better leader, B, to be a better teacher, and C, to be a better human. It allows me to be less defensive when I hear something that I don't like and try to take it in for what that person's intention or, deepest feeling might be. And it's actually been super helpful to me. There's a ton of stuff I've learned from the research over time, but that might be the most helpful one.
And what are the one or two takeaways you'd like us to take away from today's session?
I can go first again if you want. I
Sure, go
think it gets back to what we teach in the classroom. When you're uncomfortable, you're learning something. And so many of us like to lean away from that discomfort, but if you can lean into it, you are growing and learning something about yourself and learning something about how you want to show up particularly in your professional life, which is what we're teaching skills about. And so along with that, feedback is kind, even when it's hard. And people are learning through feedback. And if you can learn how to give feedback in a firm but constructive way, and if you can learn to receive it with a spirit of generosity, you will grow both as a professional and as a leader. And again, it ties into the discomfort. It's often very uncomfortable to do, both as the giver of feedback and the recipient of feedback. But those are growth moments on both sides of the equation.
Thank you. Hillary?
I think actually the biggest takeaway, this is for me, not so much for the students, but the biggest takeaway is it's actually like it's work to do this class because it's so different from what we normally do, but it's totally worth it. Like it was a huge experiment the first time I did it, and I have never looked back and never regretted it. And I can tell you that for years I taught securities regulation. And with the exception of one student, no one ever told me it changed their life. But this class, people tell me that all the time. And that makes all of it worth it.
Wow, that's pretty heavy. That's a good ending. I like that. So first of all, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. And I want to just repeat some of the takeaways because I love them. First, this is hard work to teach a class that you've never taught before, particularly one that's not part of the traditional curriculum, but it is totally worth it because you can change people's lives. When you're uncomfortable, you're learning something. Feedback is kind, even when it's hard. And my two lessons are that if I were a student at Georgetown University Law School, I would be the first man to ever enroll in your class because I would love this class and I'm positive I would learn a lot. And I disagree with only one thing you said today, and that is you said you don't teach institutional change, but you actually do, because you're teaching these skills to women who will change institutions as a result of your class. So in that way, you are teaching institutional change. As Nikki said in the chat, thank you for this impactful and insightful panel. Thank you, Hillary Sale. Thank you, Allison Spada. You're fantastic. Great course. We have a lot to learn from you, and I'm sure some people will follow up with you. My goal was to end today's session at 6:04. That's the time it is right now, so we succeeded. So thanks, everybody, for tuning in. Bye-bye.